Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, October 24th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in those wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show that the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Since World War II ended in 1945, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain economic control of the world, and they continue to do so today. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, his war provocations against Russia and China, and his drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted those policies. Our anti-war group, Aware, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001 and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have carried on an imperial campaign to maintain this control. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon the administration to 1. Establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2. End the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3. Cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 800 U.S. military bases ringing Eurasia. Russia has 15 bases outside its territory. China has 1. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4. Stop support of stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5. Lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update and make more usable nuclear weapons. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, starting with Karen Aram on Indonesia or something else.
Well, I'll start with Indonesia.
Okay.
This morning on The Real News, there was an interview by Aaron Mate with, let's see, Professor Brad Simpson. He's an associate professor of history and Asian studies at the University of Connecticut. He is founder and director of the Indonesia and East Timor Documentation Project at the National Security Archive. He's the author of the book Economist with Guns, or Authoritarian Development in U.S.-Indonesian Relations, 1960 to 1968. Now, Aaron asked him about the fact that in 1965, the Indonesian General Suharto launched a genocide that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Suharto's campaign targeted communists and dissidents and led to the overthrow of Indonesia's first president, Sukarno. This happened with critical U.S. support, and now a release of classified documents helps explain how. The documents show U.S. officials received regular updates and cheered as the bloodbath unfolded. They offered help to quash media coverage and even supplied a list of people to target. What emerges from these documents is the vital U.S. role in what Human Rights Watch calls one of the 20th century's worst atrocities. Joining me, and then he goes on to say, joining me now is Brad Simpson. He introduces him, and Professor Simpson refers to several things related to this document, and he does make some claims that are questionable. Okay, that's the only way I'm going to put it, because I've read some of the commentaries after this interview that. He's almost an apologist in some ways for what happened. He's claiming that, I don't know if I want to go into that or not, I'm sorry. Let me just say this, but in '65, Indonesia was embroiled in a low-intensity war with Britain over the formation of Malaysia. The U.S. was embroiled in Vietnam, and the Johnson administration, fearing the growing power of the Communist Party, had accelerated these covert operations that had been taking place primarily under the Kennedy administration and previous to that, under the Eisenhower administration. And there was bombing that took place in the 50s. I think about 1 million people supposedly were killed at that time. The U.S. bombers, and along with the Indonesian military, that was during the 50s. And so this was then further on, then in the 60s. Now, what happened on September 30th was when a few high-ranking members of the Indonesian Communist Party, known as the PKI, collaborated with a number of Indonesian military officers to launch an attempted purge of the armed forces. This is what they're claiming. This September 30th movement was very quickly defeated, and in the aftermath of the movement, General Suharto and his allies launched what historian John Rousseau has called a counter-coup, in which they used the pretext of the September 30th movement as an excuse for launching a campaign of mass murder against members of the Indonesian Communist Party and other affiliated organizations, and basically anyone who they thought might stand in the way. Now, over the next 5 months, between October and March of '66, the Army and the paramilitary allies killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 unarmed civilians and imprisoned up to 1 million more, all while the U.S. provided crucial political and military and economic support. Now, I'm sorry, and I apologize for having to read this. What I think is important that comes out of this is the fact that the document, and this document is dated 1965, it's a telegram from the Foreign Service of the United States of America, dated 10/23/65, and I can't read it. The print is too faint, but it does prove the complicity. And I want to point out, since I did talk about this actually 2 years ago on the AWARE program, Carl, with you about the fact that there was a film, I think his name is Oppenheimer, an American who now resides in Holland, and he would not reveal his producer, fellow producer on the film, but they actually used many of the military people who had been involved in the massacre, now old, and had them do reenactments. And evidently it's very, very chilling. I can't bring myself to watch it, but Oppenheimer was interviewed by Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, and he did reveal during that one interview how complicit. I actually see it as the U.S. having instigated it. So when we say they help is not the right word to use. They actually instigated it. And he actually revealed the two names of the two U.S. Foreign Service people who were involved in presenting a list of the people to be targeted, to be exterminated, to the Indonesian top military brass on a regular basis. They had a full list. Well, what this entails, and this is what people have to realize, they didn't just do away and commit genocide against the so-called communist, but this is what often happens, is they ended up killing almost everyone who was Chinese. But then it goes into, this is what I want people to recognize, this is what happens all over the world. Then it goes into the hinterland, or what we call upcountry, meaning you end up with farmers and peasants being tortured and murdered, their families being killed, and their villages burned down because someone has the power to do it. Just call him a communist, just call him a traitor, just call him a name, and you can get away with slaughtering him, and then you can steal his property, you can take over his resources, and you also have the right to just do away with anyone you want. And this is exactly what happened. It opens up a bloodbath. And one of the things that's mentioned in this interview, why I highly recommend it, and if someone doesn't want to listen to it, they can actually read the script, which is produced here. There was a meeting between James Reston of the New York Times and Secretary George Ball. This has been revealed by Professor Brad Simpson, whereby you had Reston actually urging George Ball, our Secretary of State at the time, to do more. To do more to pretty much disseminate. I was quite surprised that the journalist working for the New York Times, who had been writing about this and cheering it, was actually in there advising our Secretary of State. One of the things that Aaron Maté, the interviewer, brings out is the fact that Kennedy was often lauded as, well, he was doing things in a more peaceful manner. But it wasn't really laudable. It was behind the scenes, it was intervention, it was forming relations with the military. It's what we recognize today as soft power. I think that's one of Joseph Nye of the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't know whether he's the architect, but that's something he promotes. Soft power is what they use before they go in and use hard power, which is war and weapons. So while it may sound like it's nicer, it isn't. It's just preparation for what's to come. So I think I'd better stop there and let you comment, Carl.
What strikes me most about this right now, Karen, the massacre in Indonesia in the mid-'60s, is how it's become the significance of its becoming the subject of historical amnesia.
Yes.
There has been a great deal of work in the years since the Vietnam War to overcome what was called the Vietnam Syndrome after the war. The Vietnam Syndrome was the reluctance of Americans who realized that the U.S. had committed a great crime in Vietnam to engage in military activities in the rest of the world. Now, for the American political leadership, this was a real problem. For example, when the Reagan administration came into office, they actually planned to do in Central America what the Kennedy administration had done in Vietnam. That is, to unleash a war, primarily an air war, against dissident elements in Central America. The Vietnam War began with Kennedy's attack on South Vietnam in 1962, and in 1981, the Reagan administration, which patterned itself on the Kennedy administration in a lot of ways, wanted to do the same thing in Central America. The problem was that as a result of the anti-war movement, a majority of Americans understood by the end of the 1960s that the U.S. attack on Vietnam wasn't a mistake. It was a crime, an international criminal activity. And therefore, there was opposition to the new administration, the Reagan administration, doing anything similarly. That same sort of historical amnesia that encouraged forgetting that the American government wanted to do in all those years applied also, I think, to the Indonesia massacre. Because at the time, the Indonesia massacre was seen as a fruit of the Vietnam program, the Vietnam attack, the Vietnam War. The democratic administrations of the early 60s that had launched the Vietnam War saw the massacre in Indonesia that you just described as a good result of their war. That's because the whole purpose of the Vietnam War from the beginning was to maintain economic control of all of Southeast Asia. And Indonesia, as a populous and rich country, was a major part of that. So American officials said at the time, I'm old enough to remember it, look, our war in Vietnam is really right because it's also allowed us to exert control over Indonesia by killing off all these dangerous communists. And it was known even at the time that the U.S. had provided the list of names and so forth that the Indonesian military coosters were out killing. And the killing expanded, as you described, into the support for the popular movement in Indonesia. So, I mean, we have to see this as part of the Vietnam War. And therefore, the massive effort underway up to today's News Gazette to reinterpret the Vietnam War as a splendid crusade or as a brave crusade or as something that these elderly veterans did for the freedom of Americans. I mean, it's all nonsense, but it's an important part of the historical forgetting that's being encouraged by our government and media of the great crimes that were done in the mid-60s, of which this was one. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the wars the United States has encouraged then and now, and what should be done about it today to prevent the administration from continuing these wars around the world. Another point?
Yes, and the reason why, some people might wonder why, I can imagine younger people saying, well, why do we focus on what took place in 1965 or the 60s or whatever? We should be looking at the world today. Well, I think it's a real, I'm sorry, but once you recognize the plan or the pattern or the map of 1965, or whether Vietnam or Indonesia, and we can go back, we can look at everything that took place even in the 50s, you recognize what we're seeing happening today. Now,
exactly.
The U.S. government, it's usually information coming from the CIA, by the way, sends out a travel advisory on a regular basis to, I don't know who they send it to, it's on their website, the U.S. Travel Advisory, and buried within their advisory, which is full of what I see as mere horrible propaganda, most of it about, I mean, Syria is one of those places they advise you not to travel to. I'm not a journalist, so I will not be traveling to Syria, but, and all the dangers involved. But buried within their advisory was this little bit. Tactics of ISIS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and other violent extremist groups include the use of suicide bombers, kidnapping, small and heavy arms, improvised explosive devices, and chemical weapons. Now, why is that such a is the word phenomenal? I mean, is that mistake on the part of someone doing this in the travel advisory? I mean, it's buried. Most people don't notice it. But we did have a journalist that did notice it and wrote to Champaign-Urbana's Professor Francis Boyle, and he was interviewed on that travel warning. and I want to read a little bit of what he had to say. I have to enlarge it, though. My eyesight is really bad. So, oh, here it is. The U.S. basically, he's saying that the go ahead, Carl. You say something while I look for it.
Okay, fine.
Go ahead, comment.
Actually, in a follow-up to what you want to talk about right now, I want to turn your attention to a piece sent to us by our former colleague Ron Zoke. Ron, who used to be on this program and maybe again, favored us with an editorial statement from the New York Times this week as an important commentary on American wars. And I think he's quite right. It is important. We may differ on how it's important and why, but what it actually says is something that we're concerned that Americans should know more about, and that is the wars the U.S. government is actually carrying on. The article is entitled "America's Forever Wars," and it picks up to your point about the continuity of American policy here, and we'll look at that in a minute. But you found the piece you're looking for, right?
Yes, I did. This was Professor Francis Boyle's interview with Sputnik. Yeah. The U.S. government has finally started to acknowledge that groups it had supported had employed chemical weapons in Syria, where the Trump and Obama administrations had sought to blame the Damascus government for such attacks. These policies were part of a wider U.S. strategy to topple the Damascus government, and it was clearly illegal under international law. The supplying of chemical weapons to the jihadists. And this is what many of us have known for some time that the U.S. government has been doing, but they have always denied it. They have always blamed the use of chemical weapons, which is outlawed, on the Assad government, which they want to topple. In the meantime, they've destroyed much of Syria in an attempt that if they can't have regime change and put in their own proxy puppet, then they'll partition. That's the usual process. Now, what he says here is that the U.S. had backed the Syrian terror groups as part of an illegal attempt to overthrow the Syrian government in violation of the United Nations Charter and the rulings of the World Court in the case of Nicaragua versus United States of America, 1984-1986. U.S. policymakers could have had no doubt that the terror groups they were financing, helping to organize, and arming had been using chemical weapons. Of course, the United States government knows full well that some of its surrogate terrorist organizations in Syria have used chemical weapons. So, and that is based upon, as I said, this travel advisory, which is very lengthy, advising you about how terrible the Assad government is, and blah, blah, blah. And then there's this little blooper or mistake, or somebody did it deliberately, God help him, or her, that the tactics of Al-Sham, and other violent extremist groups include, I'm repeating this, include the use of suicide bombers, kidnapping, small and heavy arms, improvised explosive devices, and chemical weapons. So, we got all this information after the fact, but I'm sure most Americans will never see this because they don't read the travel advisories. And it takes a smart eye, a journalist who is, or it takes somebody who is not happy with what our government is doing to blow the whistle, to make sure that some of us get it and provide the information to the public.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the war policy, regrettably continuous and continual, of the United States government. This following piece is from the New York Times, believe it or not, and not just some odd reporter at the New York Times, but from the editorial board of the New York Times. This is what they think in Times Square. I quote, The United States has been at war continuously since the attacks of 9/11 and now has just over 240,000 active duty and reserve troops in at least 172 countries and territories. Think of that. There are about 200 countries in the world. In 172 countries and territories, there are American troops, 250,000 of them finally. While the number of men and women deployed overseas has shrunk considerably over the past 60 years, the military's reach has not. American forces are actively engaged not only in the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen that have dominated the news, but also in Niger and Somalia, both recently the scene of deadly attacks, as well as Jordan, Thailand, and elsewhere. An additional 37,800 troops serve on presumably secret assignment in places listed simply as, quote, unknown by the U.S. government. The U.S. government says we've got 37,800 troops out there someplace, but we won't tell you where they are. The Pentagon provided no further information. There are traditional deployments, that's a lovely word, traditional deployments in Japan, 40,000 troops. All these years after the Second World War, we have 40,000 American troops in Japan. No wonder the Japanese think of themselves as occupied. We have 23,000 troops in South Korea, as the New York Times says, to defend against North Korea and China, along with 36,000 troops in Germany, 8,000 in Britain, and 1,500 in Turkey, all NATO allies. There are 6,500 troops in Bahrain and 3,000 in Qatar, where the United States has naval bases. The U.S. has troops in nearly every country. I'm quoting here once again the New York Times. Active and reserve service members, and the list you can find on the New York Times article, you can find this list that I have just briefly summarized. New York Times continues, Americans' operations in conflict zones, interesting term, like those in Africa, are expanding. 400 American Special Forces personnel in Somalia train local troops fighting the Shabab Islamist group, providing intelligence and sometimes going into battle with them. What you don't hear now is where the Shabab group comes from. Somalia established its independent government based on the Muslim court system that existed in the country, and the U.S. Sent the Ethiopians into Somalia to overthrow it because it was Muslim-based. One member, that's not the New York Times comment, that's mine. The New York Times continues, one member of the Navy SEALs was killed there in Somalia in a mission in May. On October 14th, a massive attack widely attributed to Shabab on a Mogadishu street killed more than 270 people, which would show the group's increased reach. About 800 troops, American troops, are based in Niger, where 4 Green Berets died on October 4th. Many of these forces are engaged in counterterrorism operations. It's a term worth unpacking, but in any case, against the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, we invaded Afghanistan, you'll remember. Against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, we invaded Iraq and Syria, you will remember. Against an affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, where our good friends, the Saudis, invaded. So far, Americans seem to accept that these missions and the deployments will require that they continue indefinitely. Still, it's a very real question whether, in addition to endorsing these commitments, which have cost trillions of dollars and many lives over 16 years, they will embrace new entanglements of the sorts President Trump has seemed to portend with his rash threats and questionable decisions on North Korea and Iran. Apparently, there were no rash threats and questionable decisions before the Trump administration. Once again, my commentary. The New York Times continues, for that reason alone, it's time to take stock of how broadly American forces are already committed to far-flung regions and to begin thinking hard about how much of that investment is necessary, how long it should continue, and whether there is a strategy beyond just killing terrorists, which Congress, lamentably, has not done. If the public is quiet, that is partly because so few families bear so much of this military burden, and partly because America is not involved in anything comparable to the Vietnam War. That's certainly questionable. When huge American casualties produce sustained public protest. There was protest other than because of the casualties, I might add. It is, the New York Times continues. I'm sorry, I keep jumping into the deathless prose of the New York Times, but when they say the things that they do, why, it's necessary they be corrected. It's also because Congress has spent little time considering such issues in a comprehensive way or debating why all these deployments are needed. That's certainly true, and it's very nice of the New York Times to recognize it. Congress has repeatedly ducked efforts by Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, and others to put the war against the Islamic State, which has broad popular support but no specific congressional authorization, on a firm legal footing. It's recognizing the fact that all these wars that the U.S. is carrying on in the Mideast are unconstitutional. President Trump, like his predecessor, insists that legislation passed in 2001 to authorize the war against al-Qaeda is sufficient. It isn't. After the Niger tragedy, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker of Tennessee, has agreed to at least hold a hearing on the authorization issue. It's scheduled for October 30th. Andrew Basevich, a retired Army colonel who lost a son in Iraq and is a critic of military operation, says that a collective indifference to war has become an emblem of contemporary America. Basevich's article, if you read it, doesn't make much about the fact of how much that contemporary indifference is constructed, encouraged, and put abroad by the American government and media. But the New York Times continues, the idea that Americans could be inured to war and all its horrors is chilling, and it's a recipe for dangerous decisions with far-reaching ramifications. There are many factors contributing to this trend, the New York Times tells us. During earlier wars, including Vietnam, the draft put most families at risk of having a loved one go to war, but now America has all volunteer armed forces. There's a germ of truth in that, by the way, but the whole notion that the opposition to the Vietnam War came because middle-class kids were being drafted for it is nonsense, my friends. I was there and I know.
So was I. I disagree, Carl. I'm sorry.
But look, come on. Anyone of the proper class background who wanted to get out of the Vietnam War could do so. There was not the draft was not the reason for the opposition to the war that did indeed grow up primarily on campuses and among students in the 1960s. It was a complex and important phenomenon, but it wasn't just because of the draft.
It wasn't just because of the draft, but as an organizer of the movement, the anti-war movement, in the early 70s in D.C., we were very successful in 1973 when Nixon was reelected. We were very successful. We had more people. I mean, it didn't compare, I guess, with what you had in 2001, which I never heard about being overseas, but it was the most successful demonstration that people had, partly because we had been able by that time to persuade not just students, not just, but the average
Yes.
person out there had taken a stand against the war.
That's right.
However,
That's important.
However, and that was very important. However, that frightened Nixon, frightened him enough that then he ended the draft. And when we had another...
That wasn't what frightened him.
Well, it was all the demonstrators. I mean, we know that he's reported to have said, oh my God, they're, whatever. The point being that the next demonstration we had, which was against the bombing, the secret bombing of Cambodia, which took place in spring, I think it was around May or something. We had Dr. Spock and Dick Gregory speaking, and we just could not get the numbers anymore, and it was almost impossible to get people out there anymore. And I kept asking the head organizers, I was just one of the people helping out, and the only explanation they could come up with was that because it ended the draft. I agree that a lot of it had to do with the fact that students were graduating, they were getting jobs. There were people who, like your friend Tim Kendall, is it Kimball? Your friend
Kendall, who was on...
Kendall, yeah. That it was through the lottery. There were a lot of things taking place, but a lot of the anti-war movement then they actually deconstructed, and many of the socialist groups then decided it was time to go off campus and go into the factories, et cetera, to organize against capitalism, because they didn't feel that they could be constructive, do anything. And remember, the war didn't actually come to a full end until we left Vietnam in 1975. So.
The draft was connected with American withdrawal from Vietnam, but primarily because the army of draftees, the army of conscripts that the U.S. sent to Vietnam, revolted in Vietnam.
Yes,
that's the point that's been suppressed in the accounts that we've got of the Vietnam War. In 1973, the Nixon administration withdrew American ground troops from Vietnam, up the bombing, of course, and ended the draft precipitately, not because they were dismayed by protesters, but not because the administration was dismayed by protesters, but because it was dismayed by the fact that its army refused to fight anymore in Vietnam, that American soldiers in Vietnam were fragging their officers, as was described at the time. Fragging was a verb from the time that refers to rolling a fragmentation grenade under the bunk of a gung-ho officer and killing him. The fragging of officers, killing of officers by American soldiers increased precipitately in the early 70s, and by 1973, American planners realized they could not count on their army anymore. The army would not fight. And insisted on coming home. And the Nixon administration complied, not out of sympathy, but because they knew that the political cost would be even greater if that attitude got abroad. We have to remember that that's several years after Americans at home, not necessarily soldiers, all of Americans in general, were telling pollsters that they opposed the war in Vietnam not because it was a mistake, but because it was a crime, because it was immoral. The view that the war was immoral was the opinion of 70% of Americans by 1969. And the attempt after the fact to construct a great debate in America between those who thought the war was the right thing to do and those who thought it wasn't is false. That's the attempt of the government and media to cover up the opposition to the war. The American troops were withdrawn by the Nixon administration because the army revolted, but they revolted in conjunction with an American public that did not support the war anymore. That non-support had begun on campuses, certainly, but by the end of the 60s, that was the general opinion. The war was a crime, and the people who were running it were criminals.
Well, that may explain why I was able, my role was to go to the churches, and because I appear much more conservative than a lot of the anti-war organizers at the time, to go to the churches and organize. I was a student, but I was doing that. So, yeah, and so we got people who normally did not go out and protest or organize. So there may be a point to that, but there is, and you're right, that there was a large presence of veterans involved and participating in the demonstrations in the 70s. I think as opposed perhaps in the 60s, and so, or in the earlier 60s. What I think is important also to note, and put it this way, then we have to ask the question, why don't we have the huge demonstrations today? I know we've often said that it's because when the Obama administration came in as our peace candidate, people decided, okay, we'll just leave it up to our leaders and back off. Well, I think there is something to the fact that it's also about people not recognizing the personal impact it has on them because they don't see the body bags coming back from Vietnam. We know that our government decided in the late 70s, was it 79 or 80? I've forgotten, you know better than I, under which administration, I think it was under the Reagan administration, that we didn't want people to see body bags. We didn't even want them to see U.S. soldiers fighting. You don't see anything on the news today about what has been taking place in the Middle East since 2001. what we did see, in spite of the fact that there was a lot of, there was so much media propaganda in the 60s and the 70s, just as much as there is today, nonetheless, you saw monks immolating themselves. And some of us had then asked ourselves why, what's going on, which encouraged us to take a deeper look into what we were actually doing there. The other thing, because this was in South Vietnam, with the people we were supposedly helping, the other issue was Father Berrigan, who had a very high profile. He has pointed out that when they started showing pictures of the children we were killing, the children we were immolating in Vietnam, that he felt turned it around, because the American people weren't seeing that. So it was those photographs that were making us ask ourselves, if we're supposed to be helping these people, then why are we killing them? Look, our bombs are doing this. So that, I think, and that did take place in the 60s, late 60s. But then I come back to, some people are saying today that we need to focus more on the cost of war. Now, I disagreed with Phyllis Bennis' article strongly, her contention that somehow we have to blame it on the anti-war movement, that we're not reaching the American people today. And that we need to join up with these other groups, okay, which is, as you have said, identity politics. There, I've said it, IP. But the fact of the matter is, too many people are motivated by self-interest. And so it does have to be recognized, and we need to push this point, that a lot of the money that should be going to social services here is going to support the military. It's going to support weapons distribution around the world, because manufacturing of weapons and distribution is our major product that we produce in this country, along with financial services. So I think there is something to that, and I have attempted to participate and to encourage, and we do have some people focused on that particular topic. I think Morton Brussel, when you had him on here recently, besides talking about the military escalation, he also talked about the things that we could be spending money on. Now, I know you pointed out it's not because we don't have the money, it's because of the choice we use.
Yes, that's
as to
important.
how we spend our money.
That's important.
And that's my point as well. We choose to spend it on killing and destruction rather than on curing cancer, rather than having good infrastructure projects which would provide jobs for Americans, instead of health care for all. There are so many things we could be doing with the money, but instead we choose to put it into military and profits for the 1%. Carl, I just want to make one more point here, back to something you can expand upon further, is that the 4 soldiers who were killed in Niger recently, there's a lot of press out there. I can't compare to Harvey Weinstein. My daughter went to Germany for a week or two, comes back, and she said all the news she got was about Harvey Weinstein. And I said, well, they don't have RT in the airports. They only have CNN. But basically, everybody talks about, what happened, who were the Americans killed, and then what do we know about the attack, all the media, and what else should we know, and about more people. There were more U.S. soldiers killed there even previous to that. Nobody asks the question, why are troops in Niger? Well, there is one point here, and I think you pointed it out recently, is that U.S. forces have been in Niger, and I'm repeating some of what you said, Carl, but it needs to be noted, for more than 20 years. No, not really. We've had some there, yes, for more than 20 years, with a joint special operations task force created by the U.S. in 2008. This is what's coming from the press, coming from our military. In 2011, U.S. and French forces set up a counterterrorism force in the country, led by the French, with 4,000 troops and 35,000 Nigerian troops. There are now 800 U.S. troops in Niger and 6,000 U.S. troops within 53 countries in Africa, according to General Dunford. However, it needs to be pointed out, yes, 2011, when we destroyed Libya, when we exterminated Gaddafi and his people, that opened up the rest of Africa. That was a first step. Dan Glazebrook has an excellent article on that, which I have posted on Facebook, You can find Dan Glay's book online. And he claims the same thing that we've been saying, that Bocconi said at our teach-in. This is the first step. Libya was the first step in 2011. And that opened up Chad, Mauritania, Niger. Those nations have been a conduit for all of the weapons that are proliferating throughout Africa. And with our setup of AFRICOM during the Obama years, how many military bases, Carl? We have 800 U.S. troops in Niger alone, 6,000 U.S. troops. But we have, I forgot how many military bases we have across Africa. That's what's appalling, and I'm willing to bet that the number of troops are understated. But also the use, it was under the Reagan administration then that they decided to use proxies and contractors. I mean, this is the other thing. We know that in Syria, most of them are whether contractors or are members of the special forces. This is what we use so that Americans don't feel the pain so much anymore or notice it.
I think that's right. The New York Times article or editorial statement indeed it was, that I was quoting from a few minutes ago about the troops all over the world and the military bases all over the world that the U.S. Has put in place, and the wars that it's carrying on around the world, and it has been. The article talks about this beginning with 9/11/2001. Of course, it began long before that, as the U.S. attempted to maintain that economic and military dominance that it had won, in a certain sense, in the Second World War. The statement, the article, that, as I say, comes from our colleague Ron Zog in the New York Times, is unusual, but it's hardly the full story. And a comment on it came from the excellent group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, called FAIR, and under the headline, "The New York Times Laments the Forever Wars its editorials helped create." Corporate media have a long history of lamenting wars they themselves helped sell the American public. But it's rare so many wars and so much hypocrisy are distilled into one editorial. On Monday, the New York Times lamented the expansions of America's forever wars overseas without once noting that every war mentioned is one the editorial board itself had endorsed, while failing to oppose any of the engagements touched on in the editorial. The Times began by noting the sheer scope of U.S. military reach. Quote, "The United States has been at war continuously since the attacks of 9/11 and now has just over 250,000 active duty and reserve troops in at least 172 countries and territories. American forces are actively engaged not only in the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen that have dominated the news, but also in Niger and Somalia, both recently the scene of deadly attacks, as well as Jordan, Thailand, and elsewhere. An additional 38,000 troops serve in presumably secret assignment in places listed simply as unknown. The Pentagon provided no further explanation." Close quote. That's the New York Times talking about the situation. The editorial stopped short of actually opposing anything specific, instead insisting, quote, "It's time to take stock of how broadly American forces are already committed to far-flung regions and to begin thinking hard about how much of that investment is necessary," close quote. They are vaguely concerned. Here we have this massive global empire fighting an ever-changing nebulous enemy of terrorism, in quotes, with no end in sight. What can be done? It's unclear, but let's take stock, says the New York Times. Interesting metaphor. Left unmentioned in the editorial, from Afghanistan, both the 2001 invasion and Obama's 2009 surge, to Iraq, the 2003 invasion and Obama re-entering the country in August 2014 to fight ISIS, to Syria, both CIA-backed regime change and bombing ISIS, to Korea, to our drone wars in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, the New York Times has endorsed and often cheered every of these forever wars. And the engagements the Times just didn't expressly support, Thailand, Jordan, etc., because they're so routine as to not merit mention, there's no record of them opposing. Indeed, as the organization FAIR has noted previously, the New York Times editorial board has not opposed a single U.S. war since its equivocal and lukewarm opposition to Reagan's invasion of Grenada 34 years ago.
Yeah.
That's where they stepped out, right.
Yeah.
When confronted with this fact on Twitter, the New York Times foreign and defense policy editorial writer Carl Giacomo responded, quote, "In last decade, New York Times editorial board has raised many questions about U.S. military engagements," close quote. Raised many questions? Well then, never mind. Let's leave the Times' role in the creation of said global empire unexamined. The Times spends a great deal of time trying to market itself as not being the rubber-stamped pro-war outlet it obviously is. To do this, it employs two main genres of nominal anti-war posturing. The first is to call for congressional approval of a war without actually opposing it or arguing against its underlying moral or political validity. It's a process complaint that permits the New York Times to look very concerned without the messy work of actually opposing anyone in power. The argument is never, this war is wrong or unjust, as Americans came to believe about Vietnam, for example. The argument is, this war may be great, but we have a legal problem of not getting congressional buy-in, the absence of which is not problematic enough to make us actually oppose the war. We just have this legal difficulty. This is what the New York Times has said. The second is the morally half-hearted, no boots on the ground argument, like the one the Times employed in support of bombing ISIS in Iraq in 2014 and the Syrian government in 2013. They insisted, for example, that Obama best follow through on his threat to bomb the Syrian government while still opposing deep American involvement, whatever that meant. This genre supports bombing people, typically brown and poor, from afar, but draws the line at using U.S. troops to augment long-distance killing. The no boots on the ground pseudo-opposition is an admission that the only lives that matter are Americans, and that the PR pitfalls of body bags returning home on national TV are the only moral limit to the U.S. invading and occupying other countries. Cruise missiles, drones, special forces raids, and covert funding and arming of dodgy rebel groups are A-OK, as long as there are no boots on the ground, a cliche that itself has an increasingly boutique definition. What counts as boots on the ground, eh? Both of these genres permit the New York Times to look like conflicted liberals, distressed about war, without ever opposing it in any meaningful sense. Both modes typically involve appeals to gather more willing nations, other vague appeals to international support, or running through legal motions. But ultimately, after all the tortured language and qualifications, the Times always ends up back at supporting the bombing. The Times acts not as an outside voice holding power to account, but as U.S. empire's internal compliance officer, there to warn of excesses and problems around the margins, but always with the best interest of their national security client at heart. No such heavy-handed qualifications, needless to say, exist for U.S. enemies. Russia is, quote, engaging in aggressive and dangerous behavior in the air and on the high seas, the Times insisted in an editorial condemning, quote, the duplicity of President Vladimir Putin. Iran's, quote, destabilizing role in the Middle East is simply taken for granted. Its actions routinely, quote, deserve condemnation. Meanwhile, the U.S. is presented as a good faith arbiter of human rights and peacekeeping, with no broader military or cynical aims. Quote, at least in recent decades, the Times editorial board childishly put it earlier this year, American presidents who took military action have been driven by the desire to promote freedom and democracy. I mean, it goes without saying. It's just taken as an example. This is the sort of thing that we get at the extreme liberal fringe, so to speak, of American propaganda for war making, and that is the article that the Times ran this Monday, properly excoriated here, I think, by fairness and accuracy and medium. Comments?
Yeah, I don't know how much more time we have left, but I do want to point out that the AWARE anti-war teach-in that we held last month at the Channing Murray Foundation, it's 4 hours long, but it will be shown on UPTV 6 at 7 o'clock in the evening on Thursday, this coming Thursday. Don't miss it. It's really worthwhile. And we had only time for 7 of the panelists. One of the panelists appeared here a couple weeks ago, and that was filmed. And the other panelists we're hoping to get back at some point, who didn't have a chance to speak. It's also on YouTube. It has been uploaded, and those of us on the Peace list and the Peace Discuss list send it out every now and then, the link.
Other media events around town relating to the remit of AWARE and its concern with American wars include an excellent program put together by WILL AM, the radio station, and our friend Kimberly Kranick about the Vietnam experience of local people and the both veterans and protesters. That was broadcast this last week and is available on the WILL website. Recommended highly. As Karen mentioned, a friend of ours is one of the speakers. He was in prison for 4 years for evading the draft, resisting the draft. Yes.
And you were one of those who helped him at the time. He revealed that. You never revealed it.
Don't tell the FBI. The second point that I mentioned is that you may have noticed the News Gazette has been running reminiscences, primarily by veterans, of the Vietnam years recently. Dan Corkery, the managing editor of the News Gazette, says that, in fact, in connection with these programs about Vietnam and the anniversaries that prompt them, I suppose, they want to run pieces by people who had various experiences of Vietnam, including protesters and draft resistors and whatnot. So far, the only comments they've run, I've seen, have been from veterans. But Mr. Corkery at the News Gazette says that he would welcome submissions of reasonable length to run in the paper of reminiscences of the war. And I would suggest that people of a certain age who are capable of doing that do so, particularly people who opposed and worked against the war, remembering that, of course, the majority of Americans of the proper age were opposed to the war, were not veterans. And were not necessarily veterans. They were opposed to the war. There was another local event. What do we know about the Saturday afternoon meeting?
No, don't announce it.
No, there's a...
None of them attended ours.
The one at Channing Murray, right?
Yeah.
There's a discussion on socialism and related issues, sponsored by a group that Karen's not particularly fond of, but never. In any case, the discussion is going on, and if you want to go to Channing Murray Saturday afternoon, you can take part in that.
I think they're Democrats.
War is not their particular concern. Socialism is their concern. But as Karen points out, if you're a serious socialist, you have to be concerned about war.
There you go.
Okay.
Exactly. We'll see what they have to say.
Okay.
We're going to be there. You, David Green, and I.
If I screw my courage to the sticking place, I will go, yes.
You better,
Final comments?
No.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 43rd week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Dr. No's notes are being recorded on the blog newsfromneptune.com, not the Facebook page, but the blog newsfromneptune.com, and you can read them there. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Do see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to and minutes of the recent Aware meeting, for example. Link to, you've mentioned the link to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube, put together by our omnicompetent producer, Jason Liggett, and people can pull that up, and as Karen said, that will be featured on UPTV this week.
Thursday evening at 7.
Good.
Yes.
Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others. Truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.